This is our second lecture about Java FX Basics. I'm not going to go over a lot of code in detail because, again, you have the code examples and I'm doing that in the live lectures, which will also be uploaded. However, I did want to show you some what code looks like and how this whole stage, scene, pane, node, boxes inside boxes thing looks in actual code, because it is going to be different from what we've seen before. Again, the I/O and GUI stuff is always the most ugly part of any programming language. Java's no different. All right, so if we start out with the Hello World Java, this is what this is going to look like, and the key things here are, well, let's see. We had a stage and a scene and a node, so we have to import the stage. We have to import the scene, just like you imported scanners a long time ago. Import the stage, import the scene. This particular example, oddly enough, doesn't have a pane, so they don't import any kind of a pane, but they do have a button for the node, and so they have to import the button. But what's this application? Why are they importing that? Well, it's because the application is kind of the overarching object that runs the GUI. So you need the application, and your GUI, your class that is the top level for the GUI, will extend application. Only the top level class that has the GUI in it. So FX1 Hello World, it extends application. Now, if you remember in your project, I said you have to have inheritance, and it cannot be related to the GUI, and that's why. The GUI, by definition, is an instance of inheritance because you have to extend application. The other thing that's going to seem strange here is, instead of having public static void main string args, which we've had for so long, it's actually the start method that is used as the beginning point in a GUI application. And the start gives you a stage typically called primary stage, and so you don't have to create your own stage. You get that for free. Now, you do have to import the stage so that when the start method creates the primary stage, the compiler knows how to do it, but you don't have to create your own stage. If you want to have multiple windows, not just multiple sections of a window, but actually multiple windows, you can create multiple stages. That's okay. And then you start creating things. And what I do is I have a process where I make my nodes, then I make my pane and add it to the nodes. There's no pane in this example. Then I add the pane to the scene. Then I add the scene to the stage. I like to work from the smallest thing to the larger. If you find a process that works for you, by all means, use it. So I have a button, and it's just called BTOK, new button OK, and this OK is what's going to appear in the button. That's the text that appears there. And scene equals new scene, and the way the scene constructor works is you put in this case, the button. That's the thing that's going in the scene. Normally you would create an entire pane with all the layout of multiple buttons or multiple images or multiple somethings, and then you put that pane in there. And we'll see that in the next example. And then you say the dimensions of the scene, 400 pixels by 500 pixels. That's horizontal and vertical. It's completely arbitrary. Then we've created our node. We've created our scene and added the node to the scene. Now we add the scene to the stage, and that's done with set scene, and then show. That's the thing that's actually going to show it. Another example is a little better. Actually has a pane. So we say, okay, same trick. It's in the start stage. I create the node. I only have one node, which is the button. Simple example. I create the button. Then I create the pane. And by the way, this pane equals new pane, scene equals new scene. That's a pretty common thing when you only have one of these entities. Circle equals new circle. That's a pretty common technique. So we have pane equals new pane. And then I need to add the button to the pane. Well, the pane has its own unique way to add things. They're called children. Pane, get children, add, and then the name of the button. Now that I've got a pane with a button in it, I create the scene and I add the pane to the scene. Now that I've got a scene with a pane in it, I add the scene to the stage and then I show it. So you see, I I tend to follow the same process. And as we get into more sophisticated examples, you'll see that having a process, it doesn't have to be this one, but having a process is very helpful. So let's go back here. What was imported? Let's see. We had to import the stage. Now we have a pane, so we had to import the pane, had to import the button, had to import the scene, and of course you always have to import the application because your GUI extends the application. Before I move on, let me show you something else in here. This is our first example, the one with the button with no scene. This is the button that we're looking at, and this is the one we're looking at now that has the actual pane in it. And I said that the start method is going to be used. Unfortunately, not all systems understand that the start method should be used, and they are going to look for main. So some systems will insist on looking for main no matter what. How could you fix that? Well, inside your GUI, you do this. And the comment is self-explanatory. I hope this is directly out of the Liang text. I did not change it. Public static void main string args, and all it does is say launch args. That's a method. That's a method that will launch the start method. So you put that in for defensive purposes. If you have a system where you don't need that, that's great. But then you're going to take your code and try to show how cool your code is to somebody, and you put it on their computer and it doesn't work because their system is looking for main. Or even worse, when I'm grading this, my system is looking for main. So you put it in there. Always code defensively. Always code in such a way that you're going to work in the widest variety of situations. So just cut and paste that in there for all your GUI stuff. It only has to be in this top level application. Now what do I mean by top level? We're going to get to more sophisticated GUIs where it's actually not just one file or one class that makes up the GUI. There can be multiple classes where this one, when the panes start to get complicated, I like to build a pane in a completely separate class and bring it into this file. So you only need it at this top level where you're extending application. If you have multiple files that extend application, which is not very likely by the way, you would put it in every one. Okay, and then the last thing, now I've got all these different examples about showing a button different ways and showing a circle and showing a line and showing text. We'll go through those in the live lectures, or you can look at them directly with the the code is available to you. It's this show rectangle that I want to talk about next. And if I do this show rectangle, it's hard to read this, right? So I'll show you the code. What happens is they create a bunch of rectangles and they show them on the screen. And what you end up with is this. It actually creates that picture. R1 with a rectangle, R2 with a rectangle, R3 with a rectangle with funny ends, and then these rectangles here all laid on top of each other. That's what this code does. And what I want to do is use this as an example of maybe a different or hopefully improved way to write your code for the GUI. Because even though all we did was make 3 texts, 3 rectangles, and 4 more rectangles, so what, we made seven rectangles and 3 texts, and already this code is getting ugly. You're getting bogged down in the details. If I go back here, this is what this looks like. Show rectangle looks like this. There we go. Looks like this, the original version. This is based again on the Liang text. I only changed a few things here. And so they create a rectangle R1 and a rectangle R2 and a rectangle R3. And then they do this weird thing. And then they add all the rectangles. And then they do this weird thing down here where they're adding rectangles to the pane. They're creating them in a little loop. That's the one that makes the 4 rectangles, one on top of another. I have a lot of issues with this code. and I'll get to the issues in a minute, but let's talk about this. Rectangle R1 equals new rectangle, and this is the X position, Y position, horizontal pixels, vertical pixels. And then it says R1.setStroke color.black, setFill color white. So setStroke is the outer line. setFill is the fill. How do you know this? This is what Google is for. This is what tutorials are for. This is what the Oracle help pages are for. There are plenty of examples about these things. And then they do with R2, new rectangle. They don't do anything. It's just defaulted, I think, to a black. The outer lines are black. The inner line is nothing. And then they do this weird stuff with R3. How do you know arc width exists? How do you know arc height exists? Again, that's what Google is for. And again, there are hundreds of things you can do with a rectangle, of which you're probably only going to do 3. You know, you're going to position it and you might rotate it and you might color it. One thing to point out though here, color, black. In order to use a color, it turns out, it's an object. You have to import the color. And same with the text. When they made text, they had to import text as an object just to type stuff on the screen. So here we've got, I mean, it shouldn't shock you that we had to import the rectangle, right? So here we've got the stage, the pane, the scene, and then the rectangles, the text, and the colors, and all of that is going to be in the application. Now, what's this collections about? I believe they set some kind of a padding in there, and that's where the collections gets used. All right, so what happens here? There's some odd things that I don't like about this code. They create the rectangle R1, they create the rectangle R2, they create the rectangle R3, and then they're going to add R1 to the pane, but before they do that, they want to put that text R1 in front of it, so they do it this way, add new text, and they basically created the text inside of the add. Are you allowed to do that? Yeah, you're allowed to do that. Should you do that? I say mostly no. I like to give everything I create a name, and the reason is often I need to grab it and I need to know its name in order to grab it. So it creates the text, and then we add R1. Creates the text, then add R2. Create the text, and then add R3. And then they do this loop, and they do the same cheap trick. They create R as a new rectangle, and then they add R, and the next time they go through the loop, it's a brand new rectangle. R equals new rectangle, so now you've created 2, but they're both called R, and add R again. How can they do that? We'll talk about that in the live lecture, but think about what that means. I didn't like that. So I did a modified version of that. So there's a couple things I didn't like. One is I don't like this where I name a rectangle, add it to the pane, and then I lose its name. I can't get access to it anymore. I don't like that. I don't like this text stuff. I don't think I fixed that. And what I really don't like is, look at all this garbage happened inside of start. Look how cluttered that is. And it's a fairly simple thing. If you're going to do a big GUI, you're going to have a big mess inside of the start method, and you won't be able to understand what your code is doing very well. It's very cluttered, it's very ugly, it's hard to read, and it's against the object-oriented paradigm of make methods that do little tiny things. So instead, I did a version, and again we'll go over this in the live lectures. I did a version where I created all of these things as attributes rather than variables, and instead of that weird thing with R, I actually created an array of rectangles, and then here's my start. It's only this big. And all of that stuff that was in the lines before where they were making rectangles and adding them to panes, I have a method to make all my rectangles. I have a method to make the rectangle array, and then I have a method to make the pane with the rectangles in it. So all the dirty work is outside of start, and I do recommend, as much as, just like I kept saying before, don't do your work in the main method. Same thing. Don't do your work in the start method. Okay, we'll pick this up with live lectures then.